Everywhere in journalism, we find that there are dark arts at work. Media are doing deals with politicians and corporations to carry paid-for journalism, which poses as honest reporting. We have reporters who accept bribes. There's a multitude of dodgy practices going on, and all of these are kept hidden from the audience. In times of political tension and financial crisis, some cut corners and sacrifice their ethical principles. How do journalists break free from this process? It's an uphill struggle everywhere. In almost every country, there's a crisis of confidence inside newsrooms. There's a lowering of the status of journalistic work. There's less investment in the work that journalists do. And there's a pervasive lack of transparency over advertising, ownership, and the corporate and political affiliations that people in journalism and media have themselves. All of this presents journalists, publishers, and people who engage with media with a massive task: to build a media culture that they can trust, to produce a system of journalism that is worthy of being termed the fourth estate. I'm joined here to discuss these issues here in London with three people who are very much at the sharp end of this work. I've got Dorothy Byrne, who's the head of news at Channel 4, Chris Elliott, who's the reader's editor at The Guardian, and Zahira Harb, who is an academic at City University and a long-time broadcaster. Gifts are global. Everywhere we get gifts. You guys will know, journalists working in tourism, journalists working in the travel industry or in any sort of sector of the economy are going to be on the receiving end of gifts. And it happens everywhere. I mean, when I was working as a journalist myself, I used to receive gifts and so on. And the question whether or not it is, impolite and discourteous, may be a cultural question, but actually people know about it. It's a simple bribe. People don't give you gifts for free. So how do you deal with that? In practical terms, what can we do about that?
In certain countries, like I have a colleague from Ghana, which the brown envelope is something that is cultural. It's not seen as corruption. It's not seen as something that journalists should be ashamed of.
So it's in fact seen as a sort of part of the working conditions.
Part because of the lack of financial stability that these journalists might face, the low wages that they get. Again, in certain in most of the Arab countries, for instance, there is this issue of hospitality. Where generosity, where it's seen if you come, to a head of state, there are gifts given to journalists. You're there, and if you don't accept that gift, it's actually seen as a kind of like insult to the person who's giving you the gift. Now, when it becomes a problem, it's when these kind of, under the table payment, brown envelope affects the way that you portray or you report on certain issues or certain personalities or certain political actors in certain countries.
So, but if we look at the media pyramid as a whole, there's a tendency for us to think that the problem of corruption is very often at the bottom of the pyramid. It's at the point where the journalist is out talking and doing their reporting. But actually, isn't the problem at the top of the pyramid? Because the ownership, culture, and the message that comes from the top drips through the system. Isn't that one of the lessons that was learnt in the United Kingdom from the whole of the scandal over News International and so on, where the problem about close relationship between the owners of the company and the executives, senior executives, with the political leadership, not just of one party, but other parties and so on in the United Kingdom, created a cozy relationship which actually allowed for the erosion of independent values in journalism.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. British politicians were actually anxious and, not to put too fine a point on it, afraid at times to challenge or speak up. and because they felt that if they did that, they were liable to have a huge bucket of ordure poured all over them and, cause them a problem. And it was surprising to see the extent of it, and the whole phone hacking issue in the UK really brought that out.
May I also slightly disagree with you? Because if you listen to what some of the people say who hack telephones illegally, they didn't start off like that. They went into the newspaper and they were really keen and enthusiastic, often young journalists, and they fell under enormous pressure to come up with stories. And I believe some of them have said, I didn't do it at first, but everybody else was doing it. Everyone else was doing it. I didn't think it was right. If those journalists themselves had in some way got together and said, well, we're not all going to do this, we can't just say that the journalists down there doing it are sort of victims, because they did it. And one thing I think you have to say is you've got to look at yourself and say to yourself, am I doing something here? I always say to people, don't do anything that you wouldn't tell your granny.
I can entirely agree with you, and you've come to the heart of the problem of the culture of newsroom. But where does that come from? Yeah. The culture of newsrooms comes from senior management and in the long run from ownership. So I would just say that, yes, people should feel that they have the courage to withstand that, but that basically means them leaving their job.
There's a simple lack of transparency so in many countries we don't know who owns the media, who owns journalism. How can we trust what they've got to say? Who are they speaking for? Are they speaking for independent forces? In many places, people regard ownership of media as a one-way ticket to political power. If you're standing, if you've got political ambitions in many parts of the world, the first thing you do is set up a radio station or buy a newspaper. So, how can people trust the news if they don't know who owns and if they don't know who the journalists are speaking for?
I think the only way you can do that, and of course, what you've outlined is as true in the UK as it is anywhere in the world. I think the only way they can do that is through the power of the readers, and that is to force the news organisations with which they engage, where they read the news, to be more transparent. And they can do that by either withdrawing their readership or, in fact, pressing regularly for either better regulation or better laws which reveal who the actual owners are.
Very much these days we see much more hands-on owner activity in the newsroom, and the editors-in-chief are very often becoming seen as merely glove puppets for owners and so on. So there's a big question.
There have been, you were talking about News of the World and Rupert Murdoch. There have been stories and stories published and people talking, journalists, editors talking about Rupert Murdoch, picking up the phone, calling them directly and asking them to, write, sure, say this or don't say that. So there is an influence on the editorial policy, on the editorial practices by owners, such as, sure, the very famous example that we have.
I think we've got to persuade both owners and journalists themselves that the number one value they have is the trust that their readers or viewers have in them, and that trust has an actual financial value, and that therefore they should be open and transparent in their practices. We know, for example, at Channel 4, that our viewers have a very, very high degree of trust in us, and it's that trust that gives the value to the adverts that appear on our channel. Advertisers want to advertise on our channel because they know that viewers trust the channel. And while in the short term, cutting corners might help a journalistic outlet, longer term, you're not going to have a sustainable business model if your customers, so to speak, don't really trust you.